Is everyone ready to begin? It is a little after 10:30. I'll call to order a meeting of the Community Technical College Leadership Council of March 1st. I'll remind everybody that this is being webcast, and everything everyone does and says is available for the viewing public. I think that's a good idea. And along those lines, so that we will be on record, if we could start by introducing ourselves, just name and location, then we can get going with the meat of the meeting. So could we, Dr. Gardner, maybe start with you?
David Gardner with the Coordinating Board.
Rex Peebles, Coordinating Board.
I'm Raymond Paredes. I'm the Commissioner of Higher Education.
K. Paul Holt, McClellan Community College in Waco.
Rex Weaver, Killeen, Texas, Central Texas College.
Cheryl Sparks, Howard College.
Mark Williams, Austin Community College.
Ron Walker, Victoria College trustee.
Anita Shackelford from Southwest Texas Junior College.
Mike Reeser, Texas State Technical College, Chancellor.
Dan Mims, San Jacinto College trustee.
Lonnie Howard, Lamar Institute of Technology, president.
Armin Cantini, Regent, Galveston College.
We always welcome the Commissioner and Dr. Gardner. And if either of you have anything you would like to address to us now, we would certainly appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much. You should have at your places a letter that we received yesterday from the governor. And this is a follow-up to the letter he sent last week to Commissioner Morath at the Texas Education Agency regarding school safety and making sure that all of our schools are doing all they can to ensure the safety of their students and complying with state statute and state policy. As I say, we received essentially the same letter yesterday. Please take a look at it carefully when you have a chance. I'd like to call your attention. The first four charges essentially are to assure that community colleges are complying with statutes, that they've followed up on audits and so forth, and that we should report to the governor about that. But if you look at the second page and you look at the items listed under number 5, it says that we are to work with the School Safety Center, the Department of Public Safety, and the Governor's Office to draft recommendations to the Texas Legislature on policy changes to keep students safe. And then it has some issues that we should look at in particular: increased quality controls, recommend for statutory safety requirements could be put in place, required reporting procedures, and then finally provisions for increasing the safety of non-instructional facilities such as dormitories and student centers. Anyway, obviously the governor takes this matter very seriously, and of course all of us do as well. I just wanted, since this meeting was scheduled this morning, we got the letter yesterday, I thought this was something that you should know about, something that you should inform your leadership colleagues at your colleges about. We have a call with the governor's office and the School Safety Center in about 45 minutes, and we will have a meeting this afternoon to talk about how we follow up. And so your colleges will be hearing from the coordinating board very quickly. We know we'll get your full cooperation, but clearly this is an issue that the governor regards as being urgent, and we will respond as quickly as possible. So please share this letter with your colleagues, and if you have any great ideas about what to do, please let us know. I'm sure we'll be in touch with a number of you in any event. So I don't know if you've had a chance to glance at the letter and ask any questions.
Commissioner, we're actually meeting tonight, so if we could get an e-copy of this during the meeting, I can forward this to put on our announcements this evening. Obviously, we won't be able to add it to our agenda, but our board meets this evening.
We will get you copies
Thank you.
during the course of the meeting.
Yeah, and we should probably just make a point to email it to all the campuses, as a matter of course, anyway.
We will do that. Any other questions or comments? No, we should find that out after our call this morning. If there's enough news to report, I'll come back to this meeting while you're still here and let you know what we learned in the call. Okay?
Well, thank you for your comments and also your work on this area. Brad?
I swore in 3 new police officers yesterday at our board meeting, and that puts us almost 80% of our authorized number of employees that carry weapons on campus. One of the things that we had a big discussion about is our own campus high school, and in that particular area, it's been designated that you can't carry conceal there because they're high school students. But then it seems high school students are the ones causing most of the problems. So we're taking a special look at that to see what else we can do to secure that building. And there's lots of things that can be done just by letting people know.
Yes.
And making sure that they're aware that there are security procedures in place and practicing them, like evacuation of the building and that kind of stuff. So we're all into this.
Well, thank you very much for saying that. We do have some overlapping interests, as you mentioned. For example, community colleges that offer dual credit courses on their campuses and have high school students on campus on a regular basis. Those are some of the issues we have to look at, and sometimes the policies and statutory language for higher education institutions are different from those for K through 12 institutions, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with those circumstances where you have students from both sectors on the campus at once. So that's a good point to keep in mind.
Okay, again, thank you.
Thank you.
At the last, looking at the agenda, at the last meeting, if our memory serves us correct, and after reviewing the tape, the consensus of the committee was really to have certain areas we could really drill down in. One of them was dual credit, developmental education reform, transferability, and marketable skills, and in relationship to 60 by 30. Those are included in here. Dual credit is at 6, developmental education reform at 7, transferability at 9, marketable skills at, if I can read my own writing, 11. There are some other items that were attached here, but unless we hear otherwise, we're going to maybe continue in concentrating in those 4 areas. Moving on to the what I call minutes, but sometimes referred to as summary notes of our last meeting on November 27th, 2017. Those draft minutes were included in your packet. Is there any discussion about those minutes? Those particular minutes? Is there a motion to accept the minutes? And second, all those in favor say aye. Aye. One other comment maybe I might have, and we can discuss it, is sometimes we're burdened with very lengthy minutes, but this may go to the other side in that they were very brief and really, do we want maybe minutes that have a little more substance in them than we've been receiving? Is there any thoughts on that, or is it just fine the way it is? Okay. Someone had raised that, so that's taken care of. Now, it's my understanding, the legislative session begins with the filing of, in a little over 8 months. And John Wyatt is going to be here to talk about item 3, legislative update and interim discussions.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So again, I'm John Wyatt. I'm Director of External Relations here at the Coordinating Board, and I'm going to present an overview of some of the interim activities of the legislature, and then go over the draft recommendations that the Coordinating Board is developing for the next legislative session. So I'll be working through this presentation, but as I go along, if you have any questions, if you want to raise any relevant points, don't hesitate to interrupt me. So the first item is interim legislative hearings. There are a few committees that will be conducting business during the interim. The first one I wanted to highlight is the Joint Interim Committee on Higher Education Formula Funding. This is a committee that was created by Ryder in the appropriations bill, and it is a joint committee of the 2 chambers. There are 5 members from the House and 5 members from the Senate. And their charge is to look at higher education funding broadly, but also with a particular focus on what they call non-formula items, so basically special items. So that aspect of it may be mainly tilted toward the university sector, but again, their charge is much broader than that. They held hearings on February 21st and 27th. The 21st hearing was regarding formula funding. So they had testimony from our Vice Chair, Stuart Stedman, from all 3 sectors regarding how the formulas currently are structured and what improvements can be made. And then the February 27th hearing was on special item funding. Under the rider, the committee is required to provide recommendations by April 15th. Of this year, so a month and a half away. And then the rider states that it's the intention that those recommendations should form the basis for the introduced appropriations bill for fiscal years 20 through 21. So according to the rider, whatever this committee recommends should be the introduced bill. So I don't know if any of you were able to, certainly no Chancellor Reeser was there, listen to some of the conversation, but that April 15th is a very aggressive deadline for them to have recommendations that could potentially fundamentally restructure how you fund higher ed. So at the last meeting, there's no more hearings scheduled yet, but it's entirely possible they could have additional hearings. But any additional information we hear about how they're going to proceed, we'll be happy to share. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you in terms of the hearing on the 21st, a big focus of it was outcomes-based funding. And so several members raised the issue of we have an outcomes-based formula in our community college sector. We have an outcomes-based formula in our technical college sector. What about our university sector? So there was a lot of conversation about the graduation bonus. What's the proper way to implement outcomes-based funding? So that was a big focus. There was also a focus on how do you make sure you're taking care of the smaller institutions. So particularly, again, to the university sector, that smaller institution supplement, and whether it's sufficient or whether it should have, as several members said, a longer runway for when you come off that smaller institution supplement. And in terms of special items, I think the issue is there was a real attempt in the Senate last time to try to do away with special items. They're outside of the formula, and the question was raised, is that equitable to have special items that exist outside of a formula structure? The institutions on February 27th, raised some valid concerns about doing away with special items in terms of how these particular initiatives are funded, in terms of new initiatives that might not have students yet to generate that formula funding. So the committee's going to have to decide if and how they will treat those special items. One thing that Senator Hancock, who's the co-chair, made clear several times was that this was not an appropriations committee. So while they talked about structure, they really didn't get down into the issue of funding specifically.
Well, if I may, I'm looking at this, how higher education institutions, and I'm going to read in community colleges in this meeting, are funded. It's no secret we're funded by ad valorem taxes, we're funded by tuition, we're funded by state funds, and then whatever we can raise on our own. Is funding looking at all four of those? I mean, you know, and ad valorem taxes is an important part of that. When I went on the board many, many years ago, we got 66% of our funding from the state. Now it's, I think the average is 25. We're probably a little lower than that, 20. Is there any looking at the effects of proposals which were knocked around in the special session about how limiting the local community college ability to tax through the ad valorem will have effect on the item number 1 there?
To my recollection, there was no discussion of this at the hearing. The focus was mainly on the structure of the formulas and how are they delivering on what the state needs out of higher education. So in terms of, again, the community colleges, most of that focus was on the student success points and the success that y'all have had in increasing the number of success points. But the issue of limitations on taxes just wasn't raised.
Well, it's not so much the issue of limitation on taxes, it's total funding. I mean, I think it's hard for anyone to look at community college funding and just look at one component. We have to look at all the components and how they affect it. Is the coordinating board looking at the overall structure of how community college receive funding, and is that the proper way? The percentage we receive from our local ad valorem taxes versus tuition versus state. I mean, is there any research been done on how those things work together? And if so, what is it? And if not, why not?
I may have to follow up with you on that one. I'm not aware of any specific research. I mean, I can tell you generally, one of the points that the commissioner has made repeatedly to the legislature is that in the community college sector, you have one of the best bargains in America, that we're the third least expensive option among community colleges nationwide, and that it's important to maintain the ability of our community colleges to offer that affordable instruction. So the different revenue sources that y'all utilize is necessarily a component of it. But again, I'd have to defer on any specific research that we've done, but I can get back to you.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, finish your question.
No, that's fine. I'm through.
So, two things. One, the third least expensive option nationwide, what's the metric? Is that tuition to students? Is it total cost to operate community
I
college?
believe that's tuition and fees is the metric. So the
it's tuition and fees.
affordability to students, yeah.
Okay, because then you have, where does the funding come to support keeping tuition low? And to your point of the other sources are critical, but I think the governor's proposal, I'm not sure how that'll affect the ad valorem side for us. Was there any discussion of that? Or maybe I should broadly, was there a discussion of community colleges separately, or was community colleges used more as leverage to what 4 years should be doing?
Well, there was specific discussion of community colleges, but again, I think a lot of the focus, frankly, a lot of the focus was on the university sector, but the focus on community colleges was to the success point model, and, you know, again, is that an example that we now need to replicate in our university sector?
Let me just underline that, just as sort of a passive observer at the meeting, it did seem that they were using community colleges and Texas State Technical College as models for what can be done. At the same time, looking at what other states were doing, there was an individual that talked about other states and how they were approaching this. So I do think the real focus, and as John said, it was emphasized several times during the meeting that this wasn't about appropriations. It was about the formulas and how the money should get there. I think the good news might be that there were several legislators that kept bringing up appropriations, and that's why they were reminded regularly. So, but I do think, that this, every district has different abilities to tax, given the nature of the community, similar to community colleges. We don't often think about, but universities, while they don't have those taxes, they have very different resources in terms of, is the PUF fund available? What's their endowment? And there are huge differences between universities in terms of resources available to bring that cost down. So it's a much larger discussion, but I think John's pointed out very well, they were really focused on outcomes-based funding, and while the other things did come up, I think part of what it tells me, Julie Eklund is here, is that I know we're aware of some of these funding differences in terms of tax base and whatever, and that's something that we can talk about with staff in terms of, is there something else we should do, and get your insight on going forward. Because I think part of that informs appropriations levels as well. How much should you fund the formula given other resources available? And that's a harder issue to crack, I think. Is that fair, John?
That's entirely fair.
On the graduation bonus, if I can go back to that, did they indicate how that would look? Any particulars, or just a general, we want to do this, we have no clue how to do it?
So our co-chair, Stuart Stedman, or I'm sorry, Vice Chair Stuart Stedman, presented the coordinating board's graduation bonus model. So what we recommended last year and has now been recommended again by the Formula Advisory Committee. So when talking about the model, most of the legislators referenced that, the graduation bonus, as the model for it. But there was also Senator Schwertner had some questions regarding whether it was appropriate to have a more penalty-based model for outcomes-based funding, and whether we had looked at that. So that's some additional information that we'll be providing to him. But I will say it seemed like the graduation bonus most people were on board with. Certainly the concept of outcomes-based funding is all but unanimously embraced by legislators. But the devil will always be in the details. And so as we get closer to session, as we draft that legislation to actually implement the graduation bonus, that's where I think we're going to have some work to do to make sure we've got a model that works.
And since I'm not personally familiar with what the co-board's model is, did that model include penalties, or was it strictly a incentive-based program?
So the recommendation is that universities would receive $500 for every undergraduate that they get to degree, except that if that undergraduate is an at-risk student, they would receive $1,000. And so this would be, it's in the title, it's a bonus. So the idea is that institutions have an incentive to continually increase their production of undergraduates, and particularly at-risk undergraduates, going forward.
Okay.
And just to put a cherry on top on ad valorem taxes, I mean, one of the reasons that the state has the third lowest tuition rate is because we have the ability to tax. And if that is going to be affected in any way, that's going to necessarily affect tuition or lack of facilities for instruction. So I thank you, Dr. Gardner, and I urge us to get some feedback and study and put a light on that. I don't think that's fully appreciated, that what the local communities are doing for community colleges. They have quite a large burden. And particularly in districts where only one county is taxed. So I think that needs, if we're talking about funding, I think we need to look at the broader picture and how legislation affects all aspects of our funding.
So just on, I'm sorry, you may have said this. On the graduation bonuses, that apply to four-year or community colleges or both?
It's just the universities.
Okay, so the coordinating board doesn't have a proposal on a graduation bonus is applicable to community and technical colleges?
No. We believe the existing models are what we should say.
But it is addressing the success points. So there's points for that and then points for transfer as well, so.
And the Success Points model was partially funded this session, correct?
Oh, yes, yes. So the Success Point model was funded at a little over 10%, I believe, of the combined enrollment and success formula. And of course, you know, the issue, well, I'm going to get into formula funding a little later, so let me hold that off. Were there more questions on this? Just a word of caution. The commissioner mentioned at 11:30, we have a call with the governor's office, and I'm going to have to be on that call. But if I don't complete here, I'm happy to come back down and complete the presentation. When the governor says, we're going to talk, we're going to talk. A couple of other interim hearings or interim committees that will be having hearings. The House Higher Education Committee has several interim charges, so we can expect that over the next probably couple months they'll begin to have these hearings. They have a charge to evaluate the impact of Hurricane Harvey, current laws on sexual misconduct, examine all aspects of dual credit courses. So I think that's going to be a big hearing. And then monitor the implementation of 60 by 30, as well as specifically 2118, which is the community college baccalaureate legislation. Again, nothing's been scheduled yet. Usually they wait until after the primaries to really schedule those hearings. So after Tuesday, we expect those will start to be scheduled. And then the Senate Higher Education Committee likewise has interim charges. Those include recommendations to promote transfer, considering the role of the state in overseeing new education locations, also to examine models of student-focused funding, including performance funding, and then to review dual credit. So dual credit is obviously going to be a big issue for the legislature. What I'd like to go through now are some of the coordinating board's draft legislative recommendations. So these are items that we've discussed with our board. We've had an initial conversation about, but we are in the process of talking to stakeholders to get perspective, including through this committee, so that we can change direction if we need to, put more meat on the bones of these recommendations. So any of your feedback is very much appreciated as we go through these. First off is our formula funding recommendations. As you know, the formula advisory committees completed their work. The chair, relevant committee chairs, and Commissioner Paredes will present their recommendations at the March CAP and April board meetings. And then once the board has approved its final recommendations, those go to the legislature for their consideration in drafting the appropriations bill for next time. So, I'm working on that. Next slide, we'll bring you right to it. One thing I'll caution is the committees have made their recommendations. The commissioner is still looking at those. So it's not for certain that what he recommends will be identical to what the committees recommend. However, the committee chairs always have the opportunity to present to the board directly regarding their recommendation. So if there is a difference, the board's going to hear both options. Yes, yeah, that is correct. Even if we agree, they're going to make their pitch. This is just a quick summary again of the Formula Advisory Committee recommendations for the community college and technical college sectors. For the community colleges, the recommendation was to fund increases in projected growth and inflation, to increase student success funding to $215 per point, and then to maintain the current core operations funding level of $68 million. The student success point increase is something that I know our board and our commissioner very strongly believe is important, because having moved to this success-based model in Texas, we need to put our money where our mouth is, and we need to make sure that we are investing in producing greater outcomes from our institutions and for our students. So again, I can't say for sure what the commissioner is going to recommend, but this is something where we strongly believe that funding success points is a priority.
What is the funding level now, John?
179? 172. So that would be a significant increase. You know, one of the points that Vice Chairman Stedman made the last week was that if you look at how our community colleges are doing since we implemented this model, success points are up strongly, and particularly those success points related to graduation. So, this is a way for us to reward institutions for the success they're having. The concern being that if we don't continue to invest in that, the incentive necessarily is weakened.
So based on the current formula in the 215 and last year's success points or the session, how much is the cost to that? What's the price point to go to 215?
May I actually ask Julie, sorry, do you know what the dollar amount is for student success points to get us up to 215? But how much total funding to get us up to? Yeah.
What, for the biennium or by year? Okay, thanks.
And then for our technical college sector, the recommendation from the committee is to fund 35% of the return value formula. As you know, the legislature went down to 28% this last session. But, I know our board agrees and our commissioner believe that it's important to show that the state is going to invest in this model, given that it is 100% based on outcomes, i.e. the return value to the state. The recommendation is also to fund increases for projected growth and inflation, as well as to fund the sector's dual credit hours on a contact hour basis. So in terms of timing, again, this will go to the March and April meetings, and then we do expect at the April board meeting, our committee will approve their final recommendation.
And when you speak of projected growth, is that calculated statewide, each institution? What formula do you use to measure funding of projected growth?
Julie, do you know our formula for how we project growth?
For growth, we look at, and then for inflation.
But there's a caveat you might want to mention. Remember, this is projected, but if the actual numbers of growth is larger or smaller, that will be reflected in the dollar amounts.
Exactly. So the numbers that we will be putting out may change, so that we will look at the actual.
And so you're saying it's on an institutional basis versus a statewide basis, calculation of growth?
Yeah, we'll collect the data statewide, and then actual data that we don't have.
But again, is it growth per institute? So if one institute is at 1 and one is at 10, are you going to give different levels of funding based on that, or is it just a general statewide?
We supply statewide and then institutional level data, so it is based, I guess.
You may need to explain generally, Julie, how there's a pot for distribution.
Yes.
That's, it doesn't exactly work either way. Individual institution weighs in, but it's aggregate. The legislature doesn't put a pot of money for each school.
That's correct. Okay. And we will supply them with the information, but they'll make the decision about the appropriation, and then the formula is used to equitably allocate that across the institutions. So we provide them information about growth and information about what a rate would look like based on the recommendation and what that growth was. But then, of course, it's a legislative decision in terms of what the actual appropriation will be. Once that has been made, then the formula is used again to allocate.
This is, I don't know that this has ever happened, so if the legislature actually decide to appropriate a much larger pot than everyone imagined, then actually what you would get for each of these measures would go up. But typically, it's a smaller pot than we might anticipate. But the formula generally is a distribution system.
Correct.
Based on that pot, but the success points is a little variation there. So it may be at some point that this group may want a more complete explanation of how the formula actually works for community colleges, because it's not an easy thing to explain in a few bullets here. And it sounds like you might want that, and Julie could do that at a.
I'd be happy to do that, yes.
Some of the more policy-oriented recommendations that the board is developing, we have a recommendation that's actually a repeat of something we brought to the legislature last session, which is to create the Texas Works program. This would be a modification to the existing college work-study program to create a centralized, off-campus paid internship program at the coordinating board, so that employers who are interested in offering paid internship opportunities have one place they can go to offer those, and then students have a single place of contact where they can search out those opportunities. Certainly not designed to supplant what's already going on at institutions, but rather to buttress the availability of internships. One of the things that our board and commissioners really focused on is increasing the number of paid internships in this state. They see it as a way to both help students afford their education, because these are paid, but also to make sure that students are acquiring those marketable skills that are so important to their post-graduation future. So that's a recommendation that we'll be bringing back to the legislature. We have a recommendation on improving student transfer, particularly strengthening the role of the core curriculum in fulfilling general education requirements and helping to facilitate transfer. You may remember last session, Senator West led a work group on the Senate side that really dove into this issue of how can we ensure that students are not just transferring, but then when they transfer, those courses are counting toward majors. So it's the efficiency of transfer. And 3 bills were introduced and considered last session, but none was ultimately successful. So we do anticipate this is an issue the legislature is going to want to revisit this session. Rex, did you have any thoughts?
Just a couple of things to add to that. The core curriculum in particular serves a lot of purposes. It serves as a general education component of a student's education, which is something that is mandated by SACS, and so most institutions will use the core to also satisfy their SACS general education requirements. But it was originally conceived as a transfer device, and it runs into the problem of everything transfers, but not everything applies. And so and you can be core complete, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're also degree complete. And so a student can wind up taking a lot of courses in the core curriculum that satisfy the core, that makes them core complete, but they may not then apply to the degree that they take. And so one of the things that we're trying to look at is how do we have a better alignment between core courses and actual major courses. And there's a lot of things in legislation that, for example, that second bullet talks about lower division courses. Legislation requires that core curriculum courses be consistent with the Common Course Numbering System. Elsewhere, or with a Common Course Numbering System, elsewhere in statute, it charges the coordinating board with identifying a Common Course Numbering System that will be used, and it tells the coordinating board to identify a system already in use. And so that is the Texas Common Course Numbering System, which is in a lot of ways actually a private enterprise now run by TACRO, will be the fiscal agent for that going forward. And so we're looking at how do you try to strengthen that relationship between a student being core complete and then being major complete. And part of this has to do with options. I mean, I think one of the things that's really come out of the work in Guided Pathways over the last 10, 15, 20 years is that students and human beings in general don't deal with options very well. And so the more options you have, the less decisive you tend to be. And oftentimes, if you have too many options, you just don't decide anything at all. You just sort of walk away from it. And students are like that as well. And so when they have too many options, then they tend to choose based on a lot of random guessing. I've seen a lot of students over the years, in my own experience, put into classes because that's the class that they could fit within their work schedule. That's the class that fit within when they wanted to get up in the morning. That's the class that fit with when they wanted to be out in the afternoons. And it just happened to be a class that fit, and it would round out their financial aid for them. But otherwise, there was not rational decisions being made about whether that would class fit with their degree program or their aspirations as a student. So we're trying to look at this in a way that will try to maximize the classes that a student takes to reduce those excess hours in the end, because it costs students, it costs whoever's paying their tuition in fees, whether that be the student, the parents, the guardians, an institution, financial aid, and it costs the state in increasing appropriations for this. So there's a lot of money. I think Educate Texas estimates that there's about $120 million wasted on excess hours. We know that there's probably at least $13 million in formula funding that go to excess hours. And so we're trying to look at different ways to reduce those things. And that's what, in a lot of ways, that's what improving student transfer is really all about. And that gets the student through the system quicker, at less cost, which makes them a tax-paying, viable member of society quicker, we hope.
And this is also covered in Agenda 9, so we can drill down and ask questions.
Talk about a little bit more there.
Yeah.
And I'll also say, one thing we've stressed with the legislature is that there's no silver bullet on this issue. There's a lot of things we can do to make transfer more efficient. But there's also, students make decisions. They change their mind. So there's responsibilities on the institutions, on the state, and on the student. But we do want to say, what are the tools that we can give students and institutions that are going to help make this a more efficient process? Next couple of items are on dual credit. Big caveat that I'll say right now, as you know, there's our dual credit study is currently underway. We expect to have preliminary results of that study in the summer. So depending on what comes out of that, we may want to have additional recommendations. We may want to modify these recommendations. But there's a couple of items on here that are things that we believe are important for us to do, and we know we need to get them done. The first is regarding college readiness. So the recommendation would be requiring high school students to demonstrate college readiness via the SAT, ACT, or TSIA before taking academic dual credit courses. This would not apply to CTE dual credit. The goal is to ensure that any student who's taking a college level course is college ready. And the issue that we've had in the past is that there are those alternate non-college readiness pathways for a student to establish dual credit eligibility, such as scores on the PSAT, a level 2 score on the Algebra 1 EOC. The SAT, ACT, and TSIA are exams where we have validated college readiness scores. And so that's the idea here. When we brought this up 2 years ago, a concern we heard from a lot of legislators was the ability of students to take those exams and ensuring that students who might be in more rural districts, students who might be of limited means, have the ability to take one of those exams. So that is something that we're working on, is what do we need to do to ensure that all students have access to a college readiness test so that we are not effectively being discriminatory against students of limited means or in rural districts. Questions? I'm going to skip to the next one because it's also dual credit. This other issue recommendation that we're looking at is requiring students to file a degree plan at 30 semester credit hours, including semester credit hours earned through dual credit. And the concern we have is that current state law says that you have to file a degree plan, 30 semester credit hours, at the end of your second semester on campus. The concerns about students who are racking up, 30, 40, 50, 60 SCH of dual credit in their high school, and are they making good choices about what dual credit they're taking? One thing the commissioner has, stressed is that dual credit can and should be a good thing. It should be something that helps students get toward their degree. But if it's not being taken in a thoughtful manner, then it really isn't helping that student get toward their degree. So the idea would be at 30 hours, you have to file a degree plan with whatever institution is providing your dual credit, so that at the very least they've been forced to think about those decisions. Questions on that one? And then the last one is regarding financial aid. These are a couple of recommendations that we're just bringing back from last session. For Texas Grant, we have a recommendation to reduce the lifetime eligibility from 150 hours to 135 hours. That would be 15 hours beyond your usual degree requirements. And then for TEOG, we want to expand eligibility to students who are in community college baccalaureate programs. As you know, we have an issue right now with schools that offer those degrees with providing financial aid beyond those 75 hours for which a student is eligible for TEOG. As we start approving additional baccalaureate programs via SB 2118, we see that becoming more and more of an issue. So we want to ensure that, again, just for those in baccalaureate programs, they are able to go up to 135 hours. Questions on that? So those are, again, the sector-relevant recommendations we're working on. If you have any thoughts on any of these, if there's anything we missed that should be a recommendation for the legislature, we're very open to hearing that. So if you have any questions or comments now, or you can always follow up with me as you think about it.
Couple of questions. Any news on the RAND study that was being conducted, or where are we on that? And then the second one I'll go ahead is just what are the co-board's thoughts on the dual credit, their recommendations on the dual credit program?
So on the RAND study, we expect to have preliminary results in the summer. Final results probably aren't going to come out until, I think, end of year. But based on those preliminary results, we should be able to say some things about dual credit and its impact. As I mentioned, there were a couple of recommendations on dual credit, but dual credit has so many aspects. So what are we focused on here? The two issues that have really been prominent for us are ensuring the rigor of dual credit and ensuring that students are making thoughtful decisions about what dual credit they take, so that they're prepped for a dual credit course. It is a rigorous college level course, and it is contributing toward their pathway to a degree. So we had a couple recommendations there that we're looking at, but we kind of reserve the right, based on the study, to add to or modify those recs.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason for the study is to be sure that it's really based in some actual research, talking with the field. Part of the study that's just starting is a cost aspect that institutions were interested in. What does it really cost to deliver dual credit? I've heard from a number of institutions some concern, recognition that as school districts want more and more students to take dual credit, they may be taking courses that maybe the student may benefit because of their rigor, but they may not benefit in terms of them actually counting towards the degree they want to pursue. And that students may need to get more information and even understand that there's There's academic dual credit and CTE dual credit, and they, one requires being college ready, the other does not. CTE can lead to some certificates that can lead to very high-paying careers, but they don't transfer to universities. And so students need to know these things when they choose their courses in a way that they don't now. So these are things that may come out of this, and there's also a dual credit study between the association and the UT system going on, and there's a draft report right now. And so, Jacob's clearly a part of that, is they're sponsoring that study as well. And so, I think generally speaking, there's a belief that dual credit's important, but for it to remain important, you have to make sure that you maintain the parameters of students being able to fully benefit, that it be rigorous, and that it not just be become a course that anyone can take regardless of preparation. And I think I've not talked to anyone at any institution who thinks it should end up at that level, but there are some things going on that could lead to that. And so I think we all want to make sure that's a great tool, continues to be a great tool for students.
And I think Rex is going to, again, address some of that on item 6, so we have a full discussion on that, not just legislative. Any other question on legislative issues?
I've got one, sorry. So I'm going to go back just for a second, and maybe I missed it, and you said it. On the Texas Works program, how is that structured? Maybe I don't even know about it now. We want to have more. Obviously, it makes sense to do it and set a goal, but how do you incent employers or others to actually participate, or is the onus on colleges to what's the model that will actually get more students to have the opportunities to participate in internships?
So the model here is that it would be based off the existing work-study program, so that there would be state funding that would help subsidize that student's pay. So the business would contribute partially, the state would contribute partially. So that's the financial incentive.
And this is state work study money. Remember, there's another pot which is much larger, federal, just to make that distinction.
That's what I was trying to, is there an economic impact to this particular recommendation, and at what scope are you looking to try to expand that, and how much money are you asking for to do that?
That's the conversation that we're still having, is what is the appropriate amount of funding to do this? Currently, the Texas College Work Study program has a portion that's set aside for, there's a requirement that I think 20% has to go to off-campus. So we've looked at, I think last time our recommendation was $1 million a year for Texas Works, but we're still talking about what's the right amount of funding that's going to let us launch this. But obviously, we have to recognize the fiscal realities of the state.
Okay, but I guess what I want to make sure is there's not a measure that colleges potentially are being held accountable for about we're not having enough participants, but we don't actually have the incentives to actually drive.
There is nothing in this about holding institutions accountable for not producing internships. This is about having a centralized process to identify these internships and to connect businesses with interested students.
And is the onus really going to be from the college out, or the business, somehow the business connected back into the colleges so they're reaching in because they know there's some incentive for them? And obviously from an employment standpoint, employers, their need workforce, so they're becoming more interested in creating programs and incentives to try to get people to fill their holes that they have.
I mean, I think the primary obligation is going to be on both the coordinating board and the businesses, but obviously the colleges are going to be a big part of this. So the specifics of how that's going to work is something that we will have to flesh out. And one thing I'll say is the reason why we're having this conversation now is to identify these kind of issues before we move forward with a final recommendation.
Okay, thanks.
Any more questions for Mr. Wyatt?
Y'all got me out of here exactly in time for my call, so thank you so much.
Unless I hear otherwise, we will hear an update from the Texas Association of Community College and the Community College Association of Texas Trustees. I think both Jacob and Rose are here.
Chairman, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I came up here this morning thinking that I was going to address only one item, but I think if the chairman's prerogative, I'd like to maybe touch on a couple of the things that were discussed by John in the previous discussion, and then certainly the governor's letter to the commissioner this morning, and maybe just provide some insight to some of those discussions. We had not been anticipating certainly the governor's letter, but the issue of campus security and campus safety is at the forefront of community colleges. So much so that Tyler Junior College earlier this year on February the 1st hosted a hearing of the Homeland Security of the State House of Representatives, where President Mike Metke testified on behalf of all of our community colleges and presented some data with regards to the level of readiness and the level of preparation that our colleges have had with regards to our police forces on our campuses, and introduced at that hearing his new director of campus security at Tyler Junior College, a gentleman who was a former FBI agent, specifically specializing in these kinds of sort of campus shootings or local shootings across the nation. It is not that far long ago that all of us witnessed the great tragedy at Umpqua Community College in Oregon. I think it was October 2015. There was a stark reminder for many of us about the real possibilities that we could have an active shooter on a community college campus. Umpqua Community College, I think, received some recognition for how it managed that crisis. And then certainly there have been many lessons learned from their tragedy with regard to how our colleges have been able to accept that. So we'll be working certainly with this agency, with the commissioner and his staff, to make sure that we address this issue very well. I think if I could channel President Metke from Tyler Junior College, one of the issues that he raised is that strengthening your security across the campus costs. There is an expenditure. There's a real expenditure to that. It's not just building your police force, that they're fully licensed police force, but also making sure that you have all the security cameras in place and all of the infrastructure needs to make sure that the campus is secure. At TJC, in addition to all of that, for example, they have also gone to the extraordinary step of requiring all individuals, students and visitors who come onto the campus, to have on themselves, on their person, a student ID, an ID that identifies them as being there for a purpose. Obviously, the purpose is teaching and learning in most of the cases, but certainly for visitors, they are not exempt of that. That allows an extra element of security. But certainly there's an expenditure that comes to that, and Dr. Metke's testimony before the Homeland Security addressed some of those needs. I do want to talk a little bit, Chairman, about the formula funding hearing that John spoke about. I think it is fair to say, Commissioner Gardner talked earlier about we were called out, we and our colleagues at TSTC, Chancellor Reeser, testified with Chancellor Hellyer at that hearing, and we were called out sort of these national models nationwide. That's redundant. We were called out as national models for performance-based funding, and I think that's fair. I think that's fair to say that was sort of a part of that hearing. But I do believe that Chancellor Hellyer specifically, and I know Dr. Reeser as well, talked about how any kind of performance-based funding system that we have is dependent on many variables, but big among them, or most among them, is you have to fund it. You have to be able to provide the resources behind the funding mechanism. Otherwise, all you have is a reallocation of current funding and nothing more. And I think that was clearly articulated by community colleges at that hearing, and to the point that Chancellor Hellyer ended her testimony by reminding the committee that while even though it was not an appropriations hearing by any means, remind the committee that to get to that 215 per point that the coordinating board may well recommend, and frankly, TACC on behalf of our members may well embrace that recommendation, to get to that point, we do not get the 215 per point for success points by taking it out of the contact hour bucket. And so I will start that here today, and hopefully we will continue to reinforce that message throughout the balance of this calendar year and the 2019 session. Because otherwise, if we do that, then we don't have a performance-based system. We simply have a reallocation of the existing resources that we receive from the state. And I think that would be important. In the case of the community college performance-based system, as you know, that was authorized by the legislature in 2013. In 2013, a committee of TACC members, and this is CEOs, CFOs, institutional research chiefs, and working in concert with our colleagues here at the coordinating board, we convened at the time a metrics committee that was chaired by Brenda Hellier. Thank you, Dr. Mims, for sharing her with us. Dr. Hellier helped us think through all of the appropriate metrics that we felt were relevant. They look at the progression of students as they come onto our campuses all the way through completion to the completion metric. And while 2013 was not that long ago, we felt that it was important for us to revisit all of those metrics. We have reconvened the metrics committee. We have tasked, and he has taken on the challenge, William Serrata, president of El Paso Community College, to lead that metrics committee. Dr. Hellier remains on us because she has incredible institutional memory. We are working with the coordinating board. Julie Eklund and her colleagues have agreed to join us in those conversations. And so we will be thoroughly reviewing all of the metrics that currently exist. We will be reviewing all of the associated weights with each of the metrics. So as an example, and I'm not suggesting that we will make this recommendation, but as an example, by comparison to the bonus grant that the coordinating board is recommending for universities, the current metrics that we have for community colleges do not weight a student's socioeconomic status. A student is a student is a student is a student, regardless of the socioeconomic status. Whereas I think the bonus grant proposal for universities do differentiate between a Pell eligible student and a non-Pell eligible student. So I use that as an example of the kind of vetting and scrubbing that we're going to be making across all of the metrics to make sure that as we prepare for the 2019 session and as we prepare our funding ask on behalf of community colleges, that we have a thorough scrubbing of the existing metrics. And if there is room and need for us to recommend a metric that does not currently exist, then we take that opportunity to make that recommendation. Before I segue to dual credit, which is sort of the last piece on me, do you have any questions on funding or metrics committee? I would provide a short update, Chairman, on dual credit. There was some conversation, and I suspect there's be some conversation later this meeting. The dual credit task force that Commissioner Gardner spoke about earlier, that TACC co-organizing and co-convened with our colleagues at the University of Texas System. We had our last meeting in January of this year. So we have completed the work of the task force. We have ended our discussions and our deliberations on many of the dual credit conversations. We are now at the back end of our process of finalizing a report. This will be a report that will be coming to you, will be coming to policymakers, will be coming to this agency, among others, as sort of the best thinking from that dual credit task force. I hesitate to describe the totality of the report because it is still a work in progress, but I will tell you that there is some sound findings in the report with regards to the scale and scope of dual credit access across the state. We added a lens of equity to the discussions to see whether there is access across the state, across the different regions of the state, and across the different demographics of our student population. And so that will be included in the report. I do believe that the report will make not recommendations, but will address some of the issues that I know this agency has brought to the fore with regards to maintaining the quality of instruction, maintaining the quality of rigor, even as we think and recommend about possibly expanding dual credit opportunities. That will not be included in the report, I don't expect, in the form of a recommendation, but that will become clear in the form of the discussion summaries that reflect the discussions of the task force. I am optimistic that the report will be one that, that lends itself to good discourse, not just within this agency, but at the state capitol as our policymakers think through about what is the right policy framework for dual credit for the next, not just for the next biennium, but frankly, for the next decade ahead. 3 data points to that point. If you look at the total number of high school students in public high schools, only about 10% of them right now are having dual credit. If you look at the total percentage of high school graduates who have dual credit, it is about 20%. If you look at the total number of students enrolled in all higher education, that have a dual credit, it's about 9%. So it's about 9%. So is there room for growth? In my humble opinion, the answer is yes. How we get to that growth, whether it's organic or it's structured, I think is part of this conversation that this report will hopefully begin to inform. And with that, I will tell you that that TACC has begun to have our internal member conversations about a set of recommendations for dual credit specifically. And what I saw here on the board that was introduced by John Wyatt with regards to dual recommendation does not, at least initially, scare me with regards to the direction of the coordinating board and the direction of TACC with that. Certainly there's room for progress, and we look forward to working with the coordinating board staff to make sure that if we can find common ground on policy recommendations, that we reach to that common ground long before the January 9th start of the next session. That's all that I have, Chairman. I'm going to ask Dr. Martinez then to talk a little bit about our trustee association and the CAVO collaboration that we've had.
Before we move, Jacob, your 3 data points, 10% of high school students have dual credit, 20% of high school graduates. And what was your 3rd point?
All students in higher education enrolled, it's only about 9% that are in dual credit. But I would tell you of the 9 percentage point, 93% of them are at community college.
Is there any data that suggests of those, of that 10% of students, what percentage are first-generation students, minority students, or anything along those lines?
We do have a breakdown. By race and ethnicity of all students enrolled currently in dual credit, and I believe that the two. And if I'm wrong, I will correct myself immediately. But I believe the two primary minority populations that I would call out. About 45% of all dual credit students, 45% are Latino. Only about 7% of all dual credit students are African American. On the Latino subpopulation, it compares to about 50% of all Latino students in high school. But for African Americans, it is about half of all African American students in high school. So we've got a big gap among African American students taking dual credit. Is that correct, Dr. Beal?
Well, also, as I think about just the strategic direction of 60 by 30 as it relates to first-generation students, which is another huge population that needs to be considered, I wonder if there's been conversations about how this might impact first-generation students in terms of if the program is expanded or additional funding is provided.
So that's certainly our end goal. That is certainly our end goal. I think if you were to take a snapshot of dual credit access 10 years ago, it might be very different than the dual credit experience of today. And certainly we ought to strive for a dual credit enrollment experience that matches the high school experience, because certainly the data that's coming out of K-12 tells us that the majority of students enrolled in public schools today, from kindergarten all the way to high school, the majority of the students are low income, and the majority of students are ethnic minorities. And so it ought to mirror it as at least as a goal for us to have.
Good afternoon. I was going to say good morning. My name is Rose Martinez, and I represent the Community College Association of Texas Trustees. I'm the Director of Trustee Strategy. So if you remember the last time I was here, I was the new kid on the block, and I probably still am. But I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing, not only as CAT, but as CAT and TAC, and a couple of other associations that are leveraging our voices at the state level, but also at the federal level. We had the opportunity, and some of you here I know joined us, to go to the ACCT, the Association of Community College Trustees, in Washington, D.C., to their annual National Legislative Summit. Together, I'm proud to say we had about 9 meetings that just TAC and CAT provided. Meetings with Senators Cornyn, Cruz, their legislative staff, meetings with folks from the Department of Education, meetings with some of the major committees that are handling higher education issues, Virginia Fox, who put forward the Prosper Act, Lamar Alexander's staff as well, to really provide them with the information that we've been providing for the state all along, but really provide a solid footprint of the work that we're doing in Texas and how important specifically Pell Grant is to our state, how important areas like workforce training are important, CTE, and really give them a good background on the work that we're doing and how critical it is that those federal dollars still come to support what they're supporting now, if not expanding. One of the pieces that I put together and just want to walk you or just share with you was a policy priorities piece. So every person that we had, and we had about 30% of our colleges there in terms of at least the diversity of the group that was there. We had about 82 participants from Texas overall, so we had a large contingency. We were able to walk the halls of on the Hill and provide some background on not only what CAT and TAC's priorities are, but the individual institutional colleges, and I really found that was a win-win for all of us. The district representatives got to learn a little bit more about their specific campuses, but at the senatorial level, they've got to understand that we can leverage our voice and that we represent over 450 people when you look at the total number of trustees, 270 people when you look at the total number of trustees and CEOs and presidents. So I wanted to share that with you to let you know that that's not a one-time opportunity. That's something that we're going to be coming back to again and again. And Jacob and I, have actually met with Senator Cornyn's office as a follow-up to really look at not only some funding policy, but also in terms of just policy in general, right? And so that was a very good first opportunity for me to understand how important it is to our trustees to be in that role. The second piece I wanted to talk a little bit about was the fact that we do have a tri-association strategy meeting. So you may or may not be aware, CAT and TAC are working very closely, hand in glove, on our legislative priorities for the 86th legislative session. But we also have included the Texas Community College Teachers Association. So when you look at that trifecta of associations coming together, it is invaluable to have our partner faculty with us, helping to identify policy priorities for this next session. The third piece I wanted to talk a little bit about was the metrics committee that Jacob mentioned. And I do want to let you know that there is a CAT representative on that TAC metrics committee. And I do that to just show you how closely aligned we are in working together on these issues, so that not only the CEOs provide input to how the metrics may or may not change, but that the trustees are informed and that we have someone there at the table as well. So those three representations of our ability to work together are something I wanted to highlight, and just let you know that CAT appreciates being a part of these conversations and appreciates coming here to provide these sorts of reports. I will end with the CAT annual conference and Trustee Institute will be held in Fort Worth at the Omni, and I will be providing that information via email to all of you. And I'm really happy to say we have secured a location. We'll have some individuals from the coordinating board there as well, speaking on the new almanac coming out. So it'll be hot off the presses, and I believe Jenna Cullinan Hagee will be there to speak to that. So if you want to know what the new numbers are, come to the conference, and it'll be a good opportunity to delve in with our trustees as well on those issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a good meeting in Washington. One of the exciting things to come out of Washington lately was year-round Pell, which is going to be great for our students. But one of the things that was frightening was the risk-sharing proposal. Would you want to talk to the group about the risk-sharing proposal?
I will say this. I'll say that there were several campuses that made some very good pitches in terms of how risk-sharing that is when students don't complete a specific course. Instead of continuing to keep that funding that comes through Pell, that funding is actually going to be taken back, a certain percentage depending on how far along that student gets. That is very damaging when it comes to the individual campuses who put a lot of time and money on the front end, and an expectation is that that student will complete. Obviously, we can't control where the students end up and if they continue on or not. We have, as you know, wonderful student support systems. Can they be better? Probably. But to have that kind of impact on a campus where some of those funds will be going back, even at the point of 75% of a class being taken and completed by the student, and obviously not completing the entire class, is going to affect our institutions dramatically. And that goes on to beyond to say that the institutional accounting that needs to take place to reconcile these particular funds, if they do go back, is going to be quite a challenge. The folks that we did speak with, I know, I think it was Senator Culberson, heard loud and clear that is an issue. I can't speak to all the meetings. I wasn't in all of them, but certainly if you have some insights, I'd love to hear that too, and how they responded.
If I might add, Chairman, it's a big deal. So Texas is heavily dependent on federal student financial aid as a way of how our students, community college students and university students alike, how they pay for post-secondary education. We are heavily dependent. One example, community college students in Texas, in total, received just south of $1 billion in federal Pell Grant alone. The risk-sharing provisions that are being talked about have to do, essentially affect student institution eligibility for Title IV funds. It is a very big deal. The House committee passed bill for the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act is a work in progress, and this is why we all went and met in NLS. We are in conversations with Senate offices, and full expectation that the Senate will have a sort of a bill that we can work with.
I hear no other questions, so we thank both of you for your presentation and also your hard work throughout the year.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Do we want a 5-minute break, or we're going to keep on going? Sounds like we'll keep on going. Rex is going to tie the bow on the baccalaureate program degrees.
Thank you. So, as all of you are aware, in the last legislative session, there was a bill passed that allows community colleges to offer baccalaureate degrees if approved by the coordinating board, and then for a lot of them, if then subsequently approved for level 2 status by the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. The bill is also very prescriptive and very lengthy, in a sense, in the kind of requirements that it places on a community college in order to be approved for a baccalaureate degree. It started with the idea that we should apply the same criteria to community colleges that we applied to all other institutions who wish to offer a baccalaureate degree, and then it adds to it from there. And it added things like having what's called the Composite Score Index, which is it's a measure of the institution's financial stability and based largely on debt and that kind of thing. Having a positive composite score index, having at least $6 billion worth of taxable property in your taxing districts, and that would include also your branch maintenance tax districts as well. And so there's a number of hurdles there. It includes having to demonstrate workforce demand within your service area, which is not something we look at regional state demand. That's not a lot different from what we do now. I think one of the pieces of it that has vexed institutions probably the most, and us as well, in trying to figure out how to operationalize this and how to look at it, is the part of legislation that calls on institutions to have 3 articulation agreements with another institution, or to talk about why they can't have 3 articulation agreements with other institutions. And the whole idea behind this is to look at the capacity of the institutions that are around you. So typically what we have always used is what we refer to as the 50-mile rule. And what that tells an institution, and this is very different than what community colleges are usually used to operating under. Because as a general rule, if a community college wants to offer something within its service area, then they just notify us they're going to do that, and then they do it. And there's no approval on our part for that at all. But the invocation of a bachelor's degree puts community colleges into a different world, if you will, and it puts them into a different game than they've been in before, and part of that revolves around this notion of a 50-mile rule, or we sometimes define it as a 1-hour drive, but typically what we use is a 50-mile radius. So is there anything being offered within 50 miles of where you want to offer this program? And if there is, then those institutions that offer that same program, they get to object to it or agree to it or whatever they want to do with it. But it's all about trying to look at the capacity in that area. Is there sufficient capacity to meet current workforce demand? Is there not? And what we find is that sometimes there is. Sometimes there is no real need for another program. Sometimes we find that there is a need for another program. I'll give you one quick example from, I guess, year before last now. And this involved a master's degree, but the principle is all the same. An institution in the Metroplex wanted to offer a master's degree within a 50, and there's a lot of institutions within a 50-mile radius of anybody in the Metroplex. And so they did their due diligence. They notified those institutions that we want to offer this degree. There were 3 other institutions within that 50 miles that already offered that degree. And when they were questioned about it, their response to this was, yes, we offered a degree, but we're at capacity. We're already taking as many students as we can handle, and we have no plans to expand our capacity, certainly any time in the near future, and maybe not even in the distant future. But the workforce demand for the skills and knowledge that would come out of that degree, there was more than enough to meet the graduates there. And so a 4th program then was justified. Like, okay, sure. And then that was the end of that. Sometimes we run into the opposite case. More often than not, we run into, and given the fact that Texas has a rather robust growing economy, then it's not surprising that more often than not, we find that our current programs are not meeting current workforce demand, and so new programs are certainly justified. But sometimes we find the opposite. And this piece about articulation agreements is really designed to try to get at this whole issue of what the capacity is. And do we need another program? Is it duplicative of the programs that are there? One of the biggest functions of the coordinating board given to us by the legislation that established the coordinating board in 1965 is to try to ensure that there is no unnecessary duplication of programs in the state of Texas. And the idea is to try to bring some efficiency to the use of state dollars and to the use of taxpayer funds for higher education. So that's a big piece of it. And that's something that, is, as I said, has vexed a lot of people. It's vexed us a little bit in trying to figure out how we operationalize that and how we tell institutions, this is what you need to do to either to demonstrate to us that the workforce demand is there, that capacity is not there. And I think we've sort of got that figured out. We've had a lot of one-on-ones with institutions over this and talked them through it. So the application process is rather lengthy. And by the way, if you want a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing, then there are even more requirements placed on it. One of them is that you also need Board of Nursing approval, and we have worked that process out with them. They have established what they think they need to look at. We've established how institutions can sort of apply to us and apply to them at the same time so that those processes are running parallel. We're not going to wait on their approval to process an application. They're not going to wait on our approval to process an application. But in the end, it will require both, and we've had a good relationship with the Board of Nursing and worked that out, and they've been very helpful. This is, again, is something they're not used to, because most of these programs are transition programs that take a student from an RN to a BSN, or really an associate degree nursing to Bachelor of Science in nursing. And the Board of Nursing traditionally has only dealt with programs that lead to licensure. And a transition program from you already have an ADN and you already have your RN license, and then you get a BSN, there is no additional licensure associated with that. And so the Board of Nursing has never actually dealt with this piece of it before, and now they have been required by legislation to do that. So this is also something brand new for them. And I say all this, this whole process is brand new for the community colleges, it's brand new for the Board of Nursing, and in a lot of ways it's brand new for us, because we're having to look at things and take account of things that we have not been required to take account of before. So it's been a little bit of a journey. We've adjusted some of our processes. Institutions have adjusted some of their processes. Board of Nursing had to adjust some of theirs. And currently we have 6 applications in front of us. We received the 6th just last week. So we have 6 applications for programs, 2 of which are the Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree. The most recent one we received was for a BSN. So we're working our way through that. We appreciate the indulgence of the institutions as they work with us for both of us to work our way through some of this and figure out, again, exactly how we're going to operationalize this and exactly what we're going to need to know and what we're going to need to look at. And then in turn, what the institutions then are going to need to bring to us and show us. And there's at least 2 of you that have proposals on the table. Austin Community College has one, and Galveston I don't think has actually been resubmitted, but I know that they're working on it because we just talked to them last week. Whoops. So no reflection on the commissioner at all. And
The governor must not have gone very well.
yeah, it may not be doing it because it's taking place pretty much right above us. But anyway, but we have at least 2 of the institutions that are seated here have proposals that are underway, and so we're working our way through and looking at all of that and trying to, I told somebody that, you spend 6 months before a legislative session trying to figure out what they're going to do to you, and you spend the legislative session trying to figure out what they are doing to you, and then you spend 6 months after that trying to figure out what they have done to you, in a way. And so we go through that same process of what does this statute mean, and how do we make rules and sense out of that, and how do we make sense out of it in a way that satisfies the statute, but at the same time, we try to be as least burdensome on the institutions as we can, and still enforce the law, so to speak. So I'll leave it at that, and be glad to answer any questions you might have about the process or the application.
Yeah, if I understood you right, there'll be, for the nursing, a single application that both coordinating board and nursing board will use? No, okay.
There's actually 2 applications, okay. But if you go to our website and you look and you click on the application for the baccalaureate degree from a community college, embedded in that application, there's also a link to the Board of Nursing application as well.
Okay.
And it is slightly different. And what we've tried to do is sort of separate the issues, if you will, so that there's not, we've tried to minimize the overlap between what they're looking at and what we're looking at.
Gotcha, okay.
So that the two of us are not looking at exactly the same things, because I'm not sure what purpose that would serve. And so there are some things where we need to look at it as well, but I think there's a lot of things that if the Board of Nursing takes a look at it and says, yes, this is good, or no, they need improvement here or something, then that also satisfies our needs as well. So we've tried to separate that, and it's almost like two parallel processes, but sort of functionally the way it would work is that we would not approve a BSN degree until they have approved it, and then we're looking at different criteria to some extent, and so then we would have to approve it as well.
Okay.
But we have linked the two together. I think actually if you go onto their website and look for the application, then you'll also find a link to our application as well.
Two questions.
Thank you.
One is about from the time a college applies, especially for like the BSN, for approval from the co-board, about the timeline for that.
Well, by statute, we have up to a year, and then I'll introduce a couple of caveats here. So one of them is that if you're a legacy institution, and a legacy means that you previously participated in a pilot project or a pilot program rather for baccalaureate degrees, there are 4 schools in Texas that fall under that in that category, and that is South Texas College, Midland College, Brazosport College, and Tyler Junior College, that were all part of previous pilot programs for baccalaureates. Then we have 60 days to approve for them. Everybody else statutorily we have up to a year. We rarely, if ever, take that long. It also depends on the amount of money involved. If the amount of the budget that submitted to us exceeds, the cost is going to exceed $2 million over a 5-year period, then it has to go to the full board for approval. That usually will add about 2 to 3 months to the process, because there's a board meeting, there's a committee meeting a month before that. We have to have our materials for that a month before that, and so that's going to add at least 2 months to that automatically, but that's only if it exceeds $2 million. If the cost does not exceed $2 million, then generally the approval process ends in my office. And in that case, then it generally can take considerably less time than that. Some of that's a function of how many other proposals we have on the table at the time, and we typically will have anywhere from, I can't remember the last time I looked at this, the number, but we'll have 40 to 50 proposals from around the state, because we look at everything from certificates through doctoral programs. So we have a lot of proposals on at one time. It can depend on how much staff we have, and right now I'm 3 short on staff in that area. Well, actually, I'm 5 short overall in the division, and so we're trying to staff up, and so there's these sort of nuances to it, though, as in anything else, will affect the timeline. But typically some of these things we turn them around 60 days, or sometimes even less, depending on. A lot of it's going to depend on also, frankly, on the shape that the proposal comes to us in. Does it require a lot of going back to the institution and saying we need more information? And then sometimes that's dependent upon how quick they are to respond.
Second question is, if you're in an area where the market demand is there, the local universities have been determined not capable of filling that demand, yet they're still kind of resisting, are there any methods in place to rectify that scenario?
So the way that particular process works is the institutions are supposed to notify before they submit their proposal, everybody within a 50-mile radius. They make that notification. There's a 30-day response period to that. So my assumption has always been that if there's no response, then that's a yes, or we're okay with whatever it is they're proposing to do. If they object to it, then we try to give, the institutions then are supposed to work this out among themselves. That doesn't always happen. And when it doesn't happen, then essentially it comes to my division in my office to settle the dispute, so to speak. I've only done that a couple of times. I have one on my desk now to try to resolve. And in that case, then, what I will look at and what my staff will look at will be this whole issue of what is capacity and the need for demand. And so part of it then, and this is, I guess, is somewhat of a crass way to put it, but some of it kind of comes down to, is there a legitimate objection involved in this or not? And, sometimes people just don't want the competition, and I understand that. Nobody really does. I mean, we all talk about how healthy competition is, but we almost always mean it's healthy for somebody else, not necessarily for us. And I understand that. And so, so part of what we'll look at then is in this terms of, is that a legitimate objection? Is there really something about workforce demand? But if it's there, if the workforce demand is there and the capacity is not there otherwise, then, then it goes to whoever is proposing the program. So, yeah.
Thanks.
And like I said, typically the institutions will work it out among themselves, and when they do that, I'm happy with that, and they're happy with that.
As we talked about at our last meeting, one of the 4 areas we want to kind of drill down in is dual credit. Unfortunately, time is getting away from us. But we briefly discussed in a couple different areas. But Rex, would you tell us kind of what's going on, if anything, that we haven't already heard?
Well, there's really not much to add to what has already been talked about. I think it's important to note that outside of those 2 recommendations that we have sort of going forward at this time legislatively, and the one is to look at the advising piece, and when that happens, and make sure that it also applies to dual credit students. And then the other is this notion of college readiness. And we did float this as rule about, I think it's about 2 years ago, 1.5 years or so ago. And it drew more comments than I've ever seen on a rule. There were 102 comments, 97 of them from independent school districts. Only 5 were from colleges. And I think that almost all of the 97 were about the access to being able to demonstrate college readiness. And so part of why we have the legislative recommendation we have is to make sure that access is there. Because as the Dual Credit Task Force has talked about on more than one occasion, then it also becomes an equity issue too, about how do you make sure that everybody who's qualified has the ability to do this. And if they can't even prove their college readiness in the first place because they can't afford it, don't have access to the test, then we've already precluded people who otherwise would be eligible. So that's a piece of it, and we think that's pretty important. And we heard that loud and clear, and it's a legitimate concern of folks. But I think some other confusion around this was that part of it was that people, at least from 3 of the 5 colleges, the objections that came around the career and technical education issue. And what we refer to as a level 1 certificate that's up to 30 semester credit hours, those have been exempted from any kind of college readiness standard by statute for 25 years or so. And nothing about the rule would change that. And so I think we've started to do a much better job of trying to differentiate between academic credit and career and technical education credit. Now, there's still the conundrum that people are going to face that when you go to a level 2 certificate or an associate of applied science degree, then statute does require students to demonstrate college readiness for those. But it's always struck me as somewhat odd in a way that we would tell a student you can take a college course, but you don't have to be college ready for it. And part of this, I think, stems from the long-touted notion of dual credit as being one of the best preparations there is for college. And we tend to not remember that dual credit, it's not prep, it is college. And so it is a college course. And so the idea that you would expect them to be, at least to be intellectually or academically prepared for that college course as we would any freshman who enters college after graduation from high school doesn't seem to be too far-fetched a notion. And I think there's a lot of support for that. And indeed, I will point out that a lot of community colleges actually enforce that provision anyway. They may not be necessarily required to always do it, but they enforce that provision anyway. But I do think it's also important that we wait for the results of the dual credit task force and the study that they're going to put out, but also the RAND study to see if there's anything in it that may call for further recommendation on our part. So a lot of what we're in is sort of that wait and see mode to see what the results of that study are, and if it tells us something that we then think we need to act on.
We have our next meeting on June the 14th, and I have a question for you or Jacob. Will the interim report that he talked about be shared, or can it be shared, or?
The dual credit task force report should be finished by then, or close to it anyway, so we just have to kind of wait and see about the status of that. The AIR study, we refer to it as a RAND study, but it's now actually started as that, and now it's the AIR study, in conjunction with the coordinating board. We probably won't have anything preliminary data from phase 2 of that study until sometime in the summer or late summer or early fall, if I remember. So.
And the two efforts aren't identical, and I think it's important to emphasize that. And much of the data from the association, the UT study, where they've done actually the analysis is for UT-related institutions, and our study is more broad. And so, but I think the two together are a nice complement to each other, and I don't think we'll necessarily have exactly the same answer or recommendation. We don't know that. But I think that's part of the strength of it but I think there will be considerable overlap in terms of the importance of dual credit and how to deliver it in a cost-effective way.
Will the AIRS or RAND study, will the preliminary results be out by our June the 14th meeting? That will be, you'll be able to share, or
I believe there will be at least some preliminary results, but there's a complete study, so the cost study's only recently begun. And I know I haven't had a chance to look at the draft from the association and UT study, but I know that at least funding was discussed. I don't know what the recommendation will be in, but I think both of those probably need to be looked in conjunction with it. And the last time I saw or some of the draft was it was saying we needed to be aware of the cost study and the results of that. So I think we're fortunate to have two good things going on, because this is an important issue mainly for the students, and to make sure they get what they want and deserve to have and continue to.
might I suggest, if the committee's for it, is if this be a major item for our next discussion. I mean, dual credit is so important, not that any of these other issues aren't, but I think maybe we can dedicate a certain amount of time, and then if there are any of these, I shouldn't say minor, but if there are any issues that can be discussed quickly, maybe just a little one-page paper be sent out to us so we can concentrate on this important issue. So anyway, those are.
Yeah, and we can certainly let you know ahead of the meeting and when we actually post the agenda about where the studies are at and whether we really have any information from them to present at that time.
Yeah. Given that, Mr. Chair, I'm looking at the time and the amount of the agenda left. I think you guys might want to consider where you'd like to spend your remaining time. The most emphasis is a guidance to people presenting, just because some of them may be more important to you than others, and those that you really want to spend time on, if you have some idea, I think it would be helpful for presenters to know.
If we are going to stick to the 1 o'clock, I mean, we have the three other areas that we identified last time that we wanted to look at were developmental education reform, the transferability and applicability, the fields of study, and the marketable skills in meeting the goals of 2030. At your pleasure, do any of those jump out at you?
If we have time, developmental education is something I would like to hear more about.
That's convenient, because that's next on the agenda.
You like what we could do, here, we could do those 3 items first
Okay.
to make sure you get.
So Darrell Booker will talk to us about developmental education, and there's, I think, a House Bill 2223 that addresses that also.
Absolutely. Good afternoon. I'll be quick since the interest of time. House Bill 2223, as you well know, is requiring all institutions to develop a co-requisite model for students that test in developmental ed. It's requiring that institutions by the end of this fall have at least 25% of their developmental ed class be put in a co-rec model. And we have there's a number of different models. Some institutions are tweaking what they currently do. Some are having to revamp how they do their developmental ed. We're spending a lot of time right now trying to educate institutions on what that looks like for that particular institution. I think some of the biggest questions is, are we already at 25%? Because a lot of institutions have been doing co-rec, but they want to make sure where they are on that sort of percentage. The piece I want to make clear is that underlying piece of the PowerPoint that talks about other than adult basic ed. A lot of folks have been worried that the lowest skilled students would be required to take a college level course, and that's not the case. They are not included in that sort of percentage. So we've had to continually educate everyone that is really the ones who are right there pretty close to that sort of college readiness break of the TSI or SAT or ACT that's allowing them to actually be in the co-rec model. So I know a lot of institutions are concerned about that. Your lowest level skilled students are not being included in that 25, 50, and 75%. What we've done recently is the statute has moved where TSI is in the Texas Education Code. We've also had to develop rules to implement this co-rec part of the code. Part of that is the DE hours of eligibility for funding. They've been reduced, as you can tell by the PowerPoint. For universities, it's been from 18 to 9 hours. Community colleges from 27 hours to 18 hours, and ESOL has remained the same. So we've had to make that change. I know as Julie here, I'd be surprised if many have gone over that 18 hours. That tends to be the amount of time that most institutions are actually charging for that group. The rules, we only received, I think, 9 to 10 comments on the rules. Most of them were clarifications on the definitions. We had a few that asked us to do things we were unable to do by statute, and then we had a few that just needed clarification as to what subjects would be included as the first level courses and so forth. The board adopted it on January 25th. So we've had 2 training sessions, one in San Antonio, one in Fort Worth. I know TAC, Complete College America, and the Dana Center has recently gone through 6 regional trainings that I heard were a great success, and we'll offer probably 2 or 3 more through this year that allow institutions to get more information about the legislation and how implementation is actually going. And then we'll do it every single year over the 3 years of this implementation. Any questions? I went through it pretty fast. Sure.
Question on the, kind of, I guess, tightening the definitions of what a co-requisite model would be. We have our acceleration in math program. It's one of ours. Is there any comments or clarification you can give us on that?
Well, we have an FAQ we've recently posted that might be helpful. We also are going to have an online opportunity for everyone to actually ask questions and kind of delve into that. Each individual school does it differently, so the more we give a definition, you find out, well, we include summer in that, and then we have to go back and explain how that actually goes to the 25%. So I'd welcome anybody, if you have certain people who are curious about that, to actually call me or Suzanne Morales-Vale here at the coordinating board to kind of walk through what your definition actually looks like.
Were you asking about the percent, or were you asking about the delivery of the co-rec? That's what I thought you were asking.
Right, and it's the same thing. I mean, once we have schools delivering. They think it's similar when they talk about it, but then when you actually dig down into who's being involved and how long it's happening and how do you move from the dev ed course to the entry level course, there's nuances that we like to hear first before we say, this is what it look. This is you're wrong, or it's perfectly accurate. So I'd rather hear it that way than.
But you still have some flexibility.
Absolutely.
If we present our methods and.
Absolutely. And we're trying to be helpful to institutions of helping them walk through to stay within the law, too. If you're doing this, well, if you just tweak this, will that work for you? And a lot of times that's what we found has been the case. The last is we also have a study. We have an IES study with RAND and AIR that's looking at the best ways of doing co-rec. So we've had some preliminary results. I think Texas is in a good place. As we get results from study, we can tweak the way we do co-rec here in the state to actually match what best practices and what the research comes back with. We're looking for success for these students, and we think we're taking the best approach to do that. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
In terms of, and I don't know if this was previously discussed in this as it was being, the House bill was actually being developed, but have you received any feedback from two-year colleges, community colleges, technical colleges about the cost or additional cost of implementation? And I understand we're now at 25%. And here's where I'm going with this. Being a technical college, over 3/4 of our students, FTICs, actually require developmental education. And what we are learning is that we actually are having to hire more math faculty and more. So has that been a concern?
We haven't heard it directly. I know early on some institutions had raised that as a potential concern, but they had to really look at their data to figure out how many that might be. They were unclear as to what would fall under that 25% before they could actually say. I think over the last month, institutions are just seeing what their 25% looks like, and I would imagine we'll hear at least more feedback on that over the next 30 to 60 days. I think once you pull out the lowest level students, then they'll have a lot of times people were including the lowest level students and saying, we're not going to hit that goal, it's too many. Then once you pull that out, then they say, okay, well, maybe now it's more doable without being a major adjustment to their budget. But I haven't heard anything recently.
All right, thank you.
I guess following Dr. Gardner's helpful suggestion, we'll skip 8 for right now and move on to 9, which is transferability, fields of study, and Rex is going to bring us up to date on that.
Yeah, there's really not much to add on the transfer issue that we didn't already discuss with regard to the core curriculum. But I do want to say a couple of things about fields of study. What we have focused on is the top 25 transfer majors. And I'm happy to say that in spite of being a little short-staffed on this and getting off to a little bit slower start as a result, we've ramped up our efforts on that. And I do believe that by the end of this year, we will have at least 20 of those 25 done, and we may very well have 24 of the 25 done, and only have 1 left that might carry over into the legislative session. But I'm fairly confident by the end of the legislative session, we'll have all 25 of those top majors done. And then we will look at where to go from there. We're thinking about what our goal should be for this, and those top 25 majors capture 60 to 65% of all transfer students. And so then do we want to try to capture, another 10% or another 15%, and how to proceed from there? And at the same time, we're also looking at those areas where the field has identified that there are particular problems with transfer, and as we get past the top 25, then that's another thing we want to look at more closely. Is there something down there that it may be number 50 on the list, but it's really problematic for students in transfer? So we started to look at some of those issues as well. But I think we're doing a really good job. And part of what I would urge y'all to do is to really look at this when we send out the announcements for committee members. And we are allowed to have up to 24 committee members, and we have fields of study committees in disciplines that I know virtually every college in Texas has that discipline. They offer courses in it, and a lot of them offer the major itself. And we don't always have a committee of 24 because we don't get 24 nominations. And the committees have to be balanced between 12 four-year, 12 community college. And so sometimes, so this is really something I need to be directing more to the four-year institutions than to the two-year. But we'll get enough two-year nominations, we won't get enough four-year nominations. Sometimes we don't get enough of either one to fill up the committee. Some disciplines are a little smaller, and that could be appropriate. But that's one thing to pay some attention to, and we also recognize that as we try to do this at a very rapid pace for right now, it actually calls on the institutions to try to send a lot of faculty and administrators over these disciplines to participate in these things. And that is something that the cost of which then falls onto the colleges to bear. One of the things that we've done in regard to this, we've gone to a two-day format which sounds like, well, gee, then you've built in an overnight stay. But we probably had an overnight stay for people who were traveling at a distance anyway because of getting here in time for a 9 o'clock meeting in the morning and that kind of thing. But one of the things we've discovered is we've gone to a sort of afternoon and then a morning format for this, and allowing people to have that evening to digest and think and work their way through this has been very helpful in that all of the ones we've done this way so far have all ended their work on that second day. And that means they're not coming back for a third meeting, or a second meeting in this case, or a third meeting, which is really helped speed up that process a lot. And one of the things I've noticed is that the afternoon, by the end of the afternoon, you think they'll never agree on anything because they're still working their way through the angst of having to change their own curriculum and why their way of doing it is not the absolute best way. And since it is, why doesn't everybody else agree with me that it's the absolute best way? And by the morning, they've usually sort of thought through a lot of that and really get down to the issue of what is it that students need to know and how do we put that into these courses in a way. Because, and I think I said this the last time we talked about this, it's interesting to me that the committees themselves rarely ever have really substantive subject matter content discussions. They rarely ever really talk about what is it a student should know to be an engineer, to be a historian, to be a mathematician, whatever it might be. What they talk about is how they do it at their institution. Well, I teach this in this course, and you teach this in that course, and I teach it in the first semester, and you teach it in second semester, and for us, it's a freshman course, and for somebody else, it's a sophomore course, and sometimes for us, it's a lower division, but for you, it's an upper division course. That still rears its head from time to time. And it's interesting that once they really begin to start thinking about what's really in the best interest of a student who wants to transfer, then a lot of that kind of goes away, and they really get down to the business of, so how do we then make this into a course that all students can take and be able to progress? And so in a lot of ways, what I'm really trying to say is I think that that the work that they do, we can be proud of the work that they've done and some of the conclusions that they've arrived at, and it's sometimes painful for them. And I will tell you that in my years in this business, when you talk about transfer, the two-year institutions point to the four-year schools as the problem, and the four-year schools point to the two-year schools as the problem. And there's enough blame to go around for everybody here. Because the two-year schools are just as bad as the four-year schools are about talking about my way is the best way, and I do it in the freshman year in this course, and that's the only way it should ever be done, kind of thing. But they do. They go through the angst of talking about that, and they discuss it, and they get through it. And we've had some really good results in places where I would not have expected good results to begin with. And most of the comments that we've received back on this, every one of these goes through a 30-day public comment period. It goes out to everybody out there. Most of the comments are positive. The comments do tend to also be about things like, well, this is the way we do it at our institution. which is then is really a comment more than a concern in a lot of ways. But in the long run, it will help to reduce excess hours. And what we know from some of our work in looking at transfer is that 2 to 4 year is a problem. Transfer from 4 year to 4 year is a problem. Actually, it may be a bigger problem than 2 to 4 year. But I also know that 2 year to 2 year is a big problem as well. And it may be actually the biggest problem of all. That's preliminary. So our programs of study focus on associate of applied science degrees and certificates, and the idea of trying to get a student to be able to move from one institution to another institution. Even in those shorter programs, transfer could be a significant issue for a student trying to go from one institution to another. And how do you sync those up as well? And while our focus has been on the fields of study, we're continuing to do work with programs of study as well. And I think we have about 4 or 5 of those that should be going to the July board for final approval. And so we're progressing with that as well.
I want to add one thing. You've heard about all the hard work there that it takes, and this may even be an understatement, what Rex told you. But it's to no avail if we don't have your help in making sure that your campuses are aware of it, that you utilize them with your students. I just recently was involved in an exercise where we were looking at a transfer issue. This was another organization outside the board, and I looked at the community college. It was a case study, the site they had for transfer, and I could not find field of study anywhere on that institution's transfer site for their students. So the field of study is something that's enforceable. The universities are required to take it. We cannot help with that unless the students are taking advantage of it. And it's not going to solve all the problems, and so we need your help to make sure that students know. We are making sure if universities submit a program in the area that it incorporates what's in the field of study. But we need that help, and I want to say, and well before Rex got here, when we developed the first field of study, that we did not on our part do an adequate job, I think. We adopted them and then went on to the next thing. Rex has a plan to make sure that we continue to make people aware of what these are. And one final comment is Chancellor Hellyer suggested to me that we need to actually produce a document sort of clarifying the process going forward, how it's applied, and we haven't figured out what that should contain yet, but I thought it was helpful when she mentioned that she thought some people at institutions did not really understand fields of study, and that's part of our job to help make sure they do. So we all need to work together because we have the same aim here, but we have to almost be relentless about it. It's not something you can do something, flip the switch, and it all works immediately. So.
A question, I think, if I understood Mr. Gardner, you may have answered it, but I just want to confirm. So if we have a student and they go through the prescribed courses for the field of study, whatever that may be, that's been approved, then that student is, and I'm going to use this word, guaranteed that any four-year school in the state of Texas, any campus will take those courses and fully transferable to their degree plan at that four-year.
To that major. Now, whether they do it or not is a different question. If they don't, we need to know about it so we can follow up.
You can force the university to accept them.
I have personally followed up twice in the past. As it turned out, the particular school did not include the math courses that were required in the field of study, and that engineering student had to take the math courses. But the university, I'll say it was Texas A&M, took every other course. Okay. Now, so I'm not to say it's not going to be perfect, and frankly, if you report to us when they're completers, there's some things where we could potentially go in. I've talked to Julie about perhaps we could go in and do a sample, and then maybe we could go in some individual cases, even when it's not reported to us, and see if it appears that it's being followed. There's also the transfer dispute resolution law, which says people can contact us if there's a problem. And Rex and I have talked, I think between us, we've probably had maybe 5 people over 15 years or so since that went to place report anything to us. So there are tools that we have in place we need to use, and in fact, we need to make sure we have somebody designated on our end, once we start talking about the transfer dispute, that is ready to chime in. But it's a problem, and we need to fix it for students, and nothing, again, will be perfect, even if we follow up on everything. But I think the number of programs we're going to have in field of study can be very helpful because it's the majority of students. And if you look at the remaining programs, there are so many you could never ever develop field of study for all of those. But there's a much smaller number of students. So this fills in where the bulk, business, psychology, criminal justice, business, the various areas of business that most students are hoping to transfer.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, Rex, you're on a roll. Why don't you talk about marketable skills and
I'll talk about marketable skills for a few minutes, and then the commissioner has asked John to fill y'all in on the conversation that they just had with the governor's office. So I'll spend a couple of minutes on marketable skills, and then I think if we could let John come up, it would be good. So the marketable skills goal, as I said about the baccalaureate bills with the articulation piece being the thing that vexes the most people. Well, I think marketable skills is the thing that vexes a lot of people with what to do with that necessarily. And so to that end, we have a conference planned in April, 9th and 10th, I believe it is, where we have asked institutions to send teams of 4. And the focus of that conference be held in Houston will be to actually talk about how do you identify marketable skills, how do you figure out what they are, how do you convey those to students. It'll be very much of a sort of practical look at how to actually accomplish the goal of marketable skills itself. And I think that folks sort of forget that this was always premised on the notion that students have been and will continue to be taught marketable skills, but we just don't always do a good job of identifying those in the language that the business and industry and public service, for that matter, that students go to will readily recognize and understand. Because academia sometimes speaks one language, business industry and the public sector even speak a different language. And how do we make sure that we all understand the meaning of the terms, so to speak? So that'll be a focus of the conference as well. To talk about that, we have some guidelines that we're going to send out to institutions very soon. We have asked for some comments on those from some organizations, and we've compiled those, and we think that we're probably ready to, David, to send to you a final draft of that and get that out to institutions. I would like to do that ahead of the conference to actually give them a look at that. We're also working on a handbook that will be distributed to students when they enter college to talk about some of the issues about what are marketable skills, and in terms of both hard skills and soft skills, but also how do they identify those, how do they convey those to an employer. And then while the goal itself asks for instructional programs to identify the marketable skills in their programs, then we also expect that career services offices and those folks would become deeply involved in getting this to the students in the end, and most importantly, perhaps counseling students at the beginning of their college career rather than at the end of it. And David, you may want to.
No, just to add, this is something we obviously all need to work together on, and it's daunting to get this going, but it's more daunting to realize once you get it going that you're never done because the skills change. And so there will always be that work. But I encourage all of you, we're inviting teams to come to this meeting, because we know there's more than one campus. And so I encourage all of you to make sure your campuses are represented. And one thing we've always learned over the years is that sometimes there's somebody out there that sort of figured it out that nobody else knows about, and we want to make sure we have the opportunity to learn from that. We do have someone, once again, coming from England who's been working on employability skills in England for a number of years, have had a process in place, and so in a different structure, a different place, and that doesn't mean we would do the same things here, but it's always helpful to learn from those people who have done it. And we do have, I think it has come to, we have a student panel starting out the night before, because it's part of this is, we always forget, part of this is not just do they have the skills, but how do students market themselves? How do they know that this is something that they could possibly do? I'll give a family example. I have a daughter who graduated in sociology, anthropology, who just started work on January 8th for Epic Systems, which makes electronic medical records, as a quality assurance individual. So she's making a very good salary because she knew that she could do this and applied, and many people with the same major would have never applied. And so we need to make sure students know that there are these opportunities, and they need to know what their skills are. And they're not always embedded directly in your major. You may learn them in other things you do, or acquire them through the internships that were mentioned. So it's an important process. Again, it's about the students. So, you know, if you see us going forward and you're concerned about some things we're doing in approach, let us know. Or if you have some people in the industry you think would be worth working with. We know that part of this is on the industry end. You know, some companies know that it isn't you get this degree and you do this job. This is the one I just mentioned, Epic. They knew that they could get people from a wide range of areas to do this work. In that case, the job offer came in 1 week. But that's a company that really pays attention to who they hire, and that there are certain things they need, but it may not be the major per se. Other cases, it has to be that. But I think we need some learning on that end as well. And so part of this longer term is we need to find a way to get industry, and industry includes government as well, because people work in government, nonprofits, to be able to sit down with people from schools and figure out how do we develop these folks. And also remember, a hallmark of U.S. higher education is we develop people, even when they have very specific, pure narrow majors, who have the adaptability to change and learn as the market changes. And we need to make sure we still develop that. You'll notice that several people in the tech industry lately have touted the importance of continuing to have liberal arts majors. Does that mean they don't want the very technical majors? No. You need both to work. And so it's a challenge. I doubt anyone here is doing exactly what they thought they were going to do when they were 18. And probably very few people are doing exactly what they were doing when they were 22. And that's because all of you develop strong skills and the adaptability and ability to change as you go forward. And we need to make sure our students have that same thing. And that's why this is so difficult, but we will get it done working together. And that was actually part of it. I mean, it's actually in a facility where their students acquire actual skills while they're in school, and they largely run this place.
Good program.
So, you know, having heard from employers over different times, some of y'all's conferences and others, and I'm going to oversimplify this idea that, you know, there's technical skills are table stakes. It's these other skills that differentiate your ability to operate in the workplace. Some of these skills are learned earlier in life. You know, there's the Partnership for 21st Century Skills was collaboration, communication, critical thinking, creativity. That feels like it's got to get it back almost sooner. It's hard to get to be 20, 22, graduating, and all of a sudden try to learn some of these skills. So are you working with Morath and TEA and the K-12? How does it get back into embedded further in the systems? And we have a lot of students, even in K-12, that don't actually go to higher ed, but they go, you know, it's now, in Austin, we've got a big area about direct-to-college, direct-to-workforce, because both of them apply. So it feels like some of these skills are things that you need to be successful, be marketable. In my impression of what employers sometimes look at is something beyond just hardcore, as you described your daughter. She may not have had the technical, but she had the other skills she was able to demonstrate in this learning. And as I've heard from, and Richard Rhodes and I had this conversation last night, that he heard from some employers was the sense of urgency, you know, getting stuff done. I mean, there's a bunch of things that seem like they're challenging to many students who graduate and go in the workforce. How do you embed that sort of throughout the continuum, even back upstream? Because we have remedial education on academics, but we have actually remedial in terms of problem solving, navigating systems that have nothing to do with just their core academic knowledge.
Exactly. You raised an interesting question because, to my knowledge, we haven't directly connected it to the public schools in the way you suggest. Now, Jarrell has left, but some of these are embedded in the college and career readiness standards that already exist. And what I think will be coming out in the revision of them. But I think with your comment in mind, we need to look carefully at those to make sure those are still embedded there. So thanks for asking, or bringing that up.
So one of the comments you made is some people may have figured it out. I think we have at TSTC. And I can answer your question regarding TEA because we launched back in January a automated process that relies on the ONET discrete skill sets to help colleges align their curriculum with the workforce needs of industry. And the way the tool works is you take the job descriptions that the corporations give you, you drop them in the tool, it translates it into these discrete skill sets and then backwards informs the curriculum. And it does it in seconds instead of weeks or days or months. Your college is arranged a demonstration of it. Alamo College has seen it, and TEA has asked for a demonstration. So we're going to show them this month how they can use that to meet Commissioner Morath's goal of making sure the CTE that's offered in K-12 is germane and relevant to the workplace that those kids are aimed toward. So I think at the conference we'll have people there. I don't know if we'll have an opportunity to show how that works, but if schools are interested in seeing this, that because it's based on the ONET and the DWA, I assume it qualifies under the existing co-board rules because DWAs count. I don't know, but I don't know if you guys have had a chance to see it yet, but I know that Richard, I talked to Richard about it a couple weeks ago, and he said he was aware that they had arranged a demo.
Here is the industry. I do know some of those. Of those things Mark was talking about in terms of these other skills that are likely, these are folks that are more likely to rise higher in the organization, or they're more likely to bring in, be likely to analyze and say, well, you know, I know this is the way you want us all to do this, but here I think is a more efficient way of doing it. And so I don't know if they're still doing it, but they were doing that work. And so I think that's why I see it as a both-way process. I think the system you're talking about works well, but I think we need to understand that at some level we all need to learn more about the workplace. And do you have an active process? And you know, some companies just don't have the resources to do that. But how do you learn and make sure you're even becoming more productive by hiring the right things?
I agree with you. I think that's why an automated tool helps get the job done. And the reason is, instead of spending all of your, what you're talking about is convening industrial employers with instructional designers. and faculty. That's what you're talking about. Well, if they spend all their time just trying to divine the various discrete skills that are contained in the various jobs that are trying to be done there, they can spend weeks and months just trying to divine that. So the beauty of having an automated system is you dump the job descriptions in there, and you've already got a listing complete with rankings of how often those skills appear in the various job descriptions. Then the dialogue that you're talking about is richer and more efficient because they have a start point to work from.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And we don't need to, but it's always, the quality of your data is the quality of the data that went in. And there's some things that are, I've looked at hundreds of job descriptions over the last couple of years, and it's been interesting. One thing that's been interesting to me is how many, if you do a search, say in Indeed, and jobs for right out of college folks, and the jobs come up, but then you start reading the ads, and they say these are people, recent graduates. They all want all kinds of experience. So it's not like, I mean, the ads don't even reflect what the key words they're putting in for the searches. And so I think, and some companies are great at it. I mean, probably more than not, but I think depending on your industry, some things are easier than others. And so I think we just need to make sure that we get to that point because, are the companies realizing we're hiring these people who meet exactly these things, but they're gone in 2 years, unless they want them to be gone in 2 years. So it's a complex process, but I think something that you're talking about helps generate that discussion, just as though it's hard to realize now, but the conversations about graduating from college and success are different because it's been informed by real data over time, and it doesn't mean the data is perfect, but it makes you ask questions that you wouldn't have or you might not have realized that, on the university side, that people are taking on average 20 more hours than they need to graduate. Well, why is that? So some schools have changed what they're doing remarkably, and the same type of data on the community college side. So that's a great tool. I have seen some of that. I've forgotten your staff member's name, but
I will tell you, if you haven't seen it in the past month, you haven't seen it. Yeah, because in January, we released the latest whiz-bang version, which is significantly better than anything you'd seen before.
I think we could fit in under our agenda future discussion items, and one of it, John, would be what you just heard in a telephone conversation.
All right. I'll be brief, but we did have a conversation with staff from the governor's office and the Texas School Safety Center regarding next steps on the governor's directive. So to let y'all know, you can expect that early next week, a letter will go out to each public junior college that had an identified deficiency on their last safety audit. That was the 2015 cycle. And we will be requesting information from those institutions to document that they have addressed and corrected those deficiencies. There will be 45 days from the date of that letter for the institution to demonstrate their compliance. Per the governor's letter, if the institution has not demonstrated compliance after that 45 days, that institution will be identified on the coordinating board's website and through a press release. For all institutions, we will be sending out a letter reminding you of your responsibilities in regards to the 2018 cycle for the safety audits, as well as encouraging every institution to submit their 2018 audit as quickly as possible. I also spoke a few moments ago with Jacob. Obviously, one of the things, we have a charge in the letter to come up with recommendations regarding policies to keep students safe. One of the things we want to make sure we do is coordinate with the institutions to understand what you're doing now, what your challenges are, and what we can do to improve policy. So I talked to Jacob about perhaps some sort of convening or some sort of way of getting that conversation going. So I'll work with him on that. That's what I have.
No promise of funding?
No promise of funding. Thank you.
Two items we kind of skipped over were the Apply Texas Common Application and College and Career Readiness Standards. Jarrell is not here, but if there's certain information we need, and we can send out a one-pager on either of those issues, or we could take it up at a different time if it's not urgent, or unless you know something.
I don't know much. I think what he was going to talk about, there are some proposed rule changes that will modify the Texas Common App a little bit. And I don't know if, David, if you remember any more about this than I do.
Well, I do know that there's,
Oh, he's got some. Is there a slide on that?
okay. There'll be an item added about foster children. There's, and, because, you know,
So,
How so?
well, you know, foster children are, for a certain period, are eligible for tuition and exemption from tuition and fees, and that's not always known through the application process. And so we'd been asked to add that. Will be for, I think it's going to be another fall 19 that will actually be available. Let's see here. We didn't have a formal representation from the public schools on the Apply Texas before. We had someone who came and attended, but now by law, they're formally part of this. I can't see it here, but, you know, we have, and I don't know exactly where they are on this, but the software that's been used to move transcripts is very, very old and requires a lot of handwork once it reaches institutions. And I don't know if they've formally made a decision on that, but I know that basic software has been. Okay. Do you want to say anything about Speedy Express or not? I mean, is there anything here you want to emphasize that you think people really need to know in terms of Apply Texas, Drell?
Just quickly, I'm sorry about that. Quickly
mentioned
for
the
Apply
first bullet.
Texas, what we've done is we've had to add K-12 to the Apply Texas Committee, which was not on there through statute. So K-12 will now have more input into the application. 2, Counselor Suite, previously international students who were even through the 2-year and 4-year institutions could not be found in the Counselor Suite. Now they can be. And 3, which I think is going to impact most of you, is we now have a username that's going to be the email address. So before, students couldn't find their email, they couldn't find their user ID, they couldn't figure that out. Now it's kind of standard practice to use email addresses. And with that, there's an address search function now. So you won't get bad addresses anymore. Apply Texas will double check the address before they hit submit to make sure it's actually a real address, so when you do actually reach back out to your applicants, you'll be able to reach them. So. All, 100%. Previously.
Question: if institutions have suggestions of questions they might like to see added to the application, is there a process in which they can do that?
Sure, you can send it directly to me, and I can make sure it gets in front of the committee for discussion. Absolutely.
Actually, you know, with that in mind, I don't know what Jarrell's thought is. The challenge is usually wanting to add and not subtract, and so so I think we have to weigh those, and whatever you want to add may be good. But I know it seems universities are always wanting to add something, and
right,
and we need to think about the student applying as well. I think historically community colleges have required less in those it's one reason they weren't participating to the same extent in the past. So if there's something you'd like to add, it's probably important.
It's more towards analytical, just predictive analytics. But,
I'd be interested. We'll take a long look at it, and we're getting to the point where the Common App wasn't so common, so we've tried to tune that back. That's correct.
Oh, Terrell, do you have any brief comments on the college and career readiness standards?
Yeah, just wanted to let you all know that Texas Tech was, as you all know, we're required to review and revise it periodically, the standards. So it's been about time for us to do that. So Texas Tech has the contract to actually help put together the vertical teams along with us and TEA. We had about, I guess, 16 members on the vertical team. I would say two-year colleges made up half of those membership from the coordinating board seats. TEA was able to put K-12 also on the vertical teams. Then we had business and industry actually help give comments to the vertical teams. So we're very pleased with what we've come up with the standards. We just wanted you to know that they'll be put out probably in about 2 weeks for public comment. So we'll give you opportunity to comment on the standards that the vertical teams came up with, and then we'll go back, send it back to them to make any changes that come back from the public comment. So you should be looking for them sometime in mid to late March for public comment.
Can I follow up on a question we said, David, maybe Terrell wasn't here, but the idea of this marketable skills component to college readiness, are these just academic skills, or is there some element of, somebody might say they're academically college ready, but they're not actually college ready because they can't manage and navigate college, or career ready because of the marketable skills component that we were just talking about? So is that embedded in what y'all are doing as well?
We embedded some career, so it was mostly academic from the college, but the career side of it, which is why we had a lot of the workforce and CTC staff on there. So I'm not, I'd have to.
Is there anything that addresses sort of the soft skills?
There's a whole set of college readiness standards that deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you come out, you'll see that in there. Absolutely.
Unless there are further questions, the next is a discussion of future agenda items and meeting dates. I think the suggested meeting date was June 14th, Flag Day. Does anyone have any strenuous objection to that? And as far as future agenda items, I know there's been discussion about drilling down on dual credit. And the other three that were identified earlier were developmental education reform, transferability, and marketable skills. Are there any specific things beyond that? And we may have a safety issue by then also.
And there was some discussion early in the meeting about a presentation by Julie's group in particular on formula funding and how that, sort of the nuts and bolts of that, how that works. And so if you're interested in that, we can put that on the next agenda as well.
If you
want to do that.
Yeah.
We'll- Yeah, okay. We can roll that together. Okay.
Can I follow up on that? Just, it'd be helpful, at least for us, as we're at the community college trying to develop our legislative agenda going to the next session, to make sure that we, at least we understand, have alignment to what they're asking for, or what the economics are going to be, when we can contact our delegation in advance. So make sure we can get that would be comprehensive, be great. Thanks.
Right. We have a motion to adjourn. So moved. Second. Caught it? Okay, all those in favor? Aye, opposed, so done. What?
Vote with your feet, he said.
Oh.
Thank you. Nice job.
Okay.